Joined now by Robert Rosenthal from IlliniBoard.com. Back again for another season of the Sunday No Huddle, but we'll talk more about that later. We just heard that great story with a bunch of Illini, including Kenenna Odeluga, going over to Africa on a mission trip. Now talking about on the field, specifically with Kenenna in the defense. He's going to have a bigger opportunity this year with two linebackers that had a lot of time last year moving on, and that's going to be a big role in the defense this coming year.
Yeah, I think Calvin Hart moving on is a big, he's moving on because of spring ball and because Dylan Rosiak and Kenenna were ahead of him. And he didn't see as much playing time next year as he did, and he moved on to Oregon State. And that's how it works now, right? You know, especially if you're a senior and you can grad transfer, you could do that several times. So, you know, it'll be interesting, all these new faces, Bielema recruits that are moving up and moving into these starting roles.
We heard from Bielema this week, sticking with the linebacker core, that Tariq Barnes is one of the most underrated players in the country. He'll pair up, of course, with Kenenna, with Rosiak, and it could be interesting this year with, like I said, you mentioned Calvin Hart. There's also Isaac Darkangelo moving on after a good season last year. It could be interesting to see how the pairings go this year for a defense that relies on those linebackers in the middle.
Yeah, it's interesting to think back of Tariq's breakout game, which was that Wisconsin game. You know, during COVID, the season was suspended, then the season was put back on. They had a Friday night game at Wisconsin, and
Halloween night.
It got blown out, got really blown out. But you know, the bright spot was a sophomore linebacker, Tariq Barnes, who made a few huge plays and was the guy in that game. So, you know, we now fast forward 4 years. He's the anchor. He's the center of the defense. He's the captain. He's the guy who it all circles around.
Let's go back before we go forward. The secondary losing a lot this year. 4 different guys that played in that Illinois secondary now playing meaningful snaps in NFL preseason games as they get ready to get to that season and hopefully make teams. So there's a lot of snaps to go around. Taz Nicholson, one of the only returners that saw a lot of time last year. What do you make of that group and the guys who are going to be tasked with coming in and trying to replace one of the better position groups in the country last year?
Yeah, and it's further hindered by Matt Bailey's injury, that he's out. Coaches have said at least until the Penn State game, if not beyond then. So, you know, one of the guys, you know, Bailey had 3 interceptions last year, played a big role in the defense, you know, played a lot in that dime package they had and was ready. So, yes, it's even more new faces. You have Taz, you have Xavier Scott, who really came on at the end of the year, and then you have question marks everywhere. So it's just that's a function of how college football works, right? That every great program you can think of that has players go on to the NFL has this exact problem on the year. Hey, we lost 3 guys to the draft. They were the anchor of our defense. What do we do to immediately have guys ready to replace them?
And of course, some of those guys could be incoming freshmen, as it seems like Brett Bielema and his recruiters really seem to focus on that part of the field, at least on defense, in high school recruiting. One of the big names that comes up to me, Sabor Kareem out of New Jersey. What do you make of those guys coming in? And are we going to see some long, young, inexperienced freshmen come in just because they're that talented and they might need them in the secondary?
I think you will. I mean, I think there's a slight advantage maybe for Zach Tobey because he was here in the spring. And so that gave him, you know, there's a big benefit to that. A high school senior transitioning to college football, the complex defense, all the different calls, to be able to do it in spring ball and then do it in fall camp is really an advantage. So, you know, some of those guys who enrolled early, I think, gave themselves the opportunity to maybe be out there a little sooner than some of the other guys. So Toby, number 5, is somebody I'd keep an eye on.
And now we're going to talk about possibly the best position group on the entire team, the defensive line. Of course, you're anchored by the law firm, Johnny Newton and Keith Randolph. We'll just start with those guys first. Just for you, after last season and then going through the offseason, the will they, won't they, how important is it having those two back in that interior defensive lineman spot?
I mean, look, if I look back on 30, 35 years, that's probably the best interior of the defensive line since the late 80s, probably, with Gardner and crew. So, you know, this is a special group, having these two to pair together. And but, you know, the question at every position on the defense is, look, those guys can't play every single snap the entire year. What does it look like for those few series where they need a breather? And what are you getting from Bryce Barnes? What are you getting from Ced McConnell's a redshirt sophomore now? Is he ready? You know, that's the real thing. You know what you're getting from Keith Randolph and Johnny Newton. The question is the depth ready to come in and not have any drop-off when they're out of the game?
I want to know your perspective on the balance between how good the defensive line is and how much they help the secondary, and how the other way as well, how those two interact. Because if you got a good defensive line, then the secondary doesn't have to cover as much. And if you have a good secondary, the defensive line has more time to get to the quarterback. Does that balance shift this year? How do you see that going?
I always quote a stat that's put out by Bill Connolly of ESPN, where he talks about returning production. He puts together a returning production number for every team. And he has studied historically what positions are easier to replace and what positions are harder to replace. In other words, if you had a really great wide receiver, he's probably harder to replace than a really great running back. For whatever reason, teams can go to the next running back and be okay, but that connection between a quarterback and a wide receiver can be special. His numbers show that it's much harder to replace a secondary than it is to replace a defensive line. For whatever reason, that's what historically has happened. Now, I know fans don't want to hear that answer, that you have a defensive line coming back, but in that sense, yes, a great secondary can make a defensive line look a little better than a defensive line can make a secondary. So it's a big task to replace this secondary. You know what you're going to get defensive line, and you know what you're going to get from outside linebackers. Everybody on the line, you feel really, really good about it. Almost all are NFL players. It's just going to come down to that balance in the secondary.
All right, we'll switch lines now, going to the offensive side of the ball. 3 returners, possibly 4 returners if you include Zy Chrysler there as well. But there's going to be a few important spots to replace with Alex Palczewski leaving. You have Pilstrom moving on as well. It seems like Kreutz is going to take over that center role. Right tackle, it's in right guard. We'll see how that side is this season with new players coming in. But what do you make of the offensive line, what they're returning versus what they're losing this coming season?
I'd say it's very similar to the year before of what they lost, and kind of have 2.5 starters back, maybe 3.5 this year. They like to find 6 guys for sure to be in the rotation and maybe a 7th guy. They've spent the last 2 Septembers kind of figuring out their line, and then once October and November arrive, they stick with that line. So I think you're going to see some, this guy starts this game, another guy starts this game, they try him at right tackle, they try him at right guard, that type of thing, until they really center on what they like. We saw that in 21, we saw that in 22, and I think that we're going to see that in 23, where they play with it a little in the non-conference, and then by the time Big Ten play gets here, settle on the rotation they want.
All right, we'll talk about the QB position quickly as well. Luke Altmaier named the starter for this coming season. He'll be the 4th starter in 3 seasons under Brett Bielema when he makes that start against Toledo. It's because Tommy DeVito only had 1 season of eligibility left. Artur Sitkowski decided to move on and start his coaching career. Brandon Peters only had 1 season as well when Brett Bielema got here. So with Altmaier coming in with these years of eligibility, it's nice to be able to look down the line, but Illinois hasn't exactly struggled with only a guy coming in for 1 season. We look at last year with DeVito. Is continuity maybe overrated at that position? And is it nice maybe to be able to have that in the future with Altmaier if that becomes the case later?
Yeah, it's the new thing in college football, right? Like, it seems like 75% of Power 5 programs have a transfer at quarterback. People let people figure out their first 2 years elsewhere and then bring them in to start their 3rd or 4th year on your campus. So it's an interesting mix. Brett Bielema has noted in press conferences, look, none of my quarterbacks have taken a snap for Illinois. Because of that, you don't know what you're going to get. They can feel pretty good and see some stuff at practice, but until the lights come on and you have you really don't know how that quarterback's going to perform under pressure, under the threat of a sack, under a full pass rush. When they practice, they can't be tackled. They're wearing a different colored jersey. They don't want their quarterbacks injured. So how are these guys going going to perform when, they get sacked twice in the first quarter. That type of thing is what they're. So I think there is going to be this feeling out period at quarterback, just like there is everywhere, until you settle in and you find your guy. And you maybe need to be a little patient with him. He might throw a couple bad picks, and you don't want to yank him too early. It's just going to be a learning experience because these are their first snaps.
All right, we end with maybe a vibe check on how you feel about this upcoming season. I can't say prediction. You don't like to give your prediction, Robert, until right before the season gets started.
Literally the night before.
So
refuse, yes.
Let's get the vibe check and maybe where we can find the prediction when you do end up posting what you think 2023 is going to be.
Yes, well, I am not ashamed to admit that I'm a fan. I write as a fan. I attend games as a fan. I come from that angle. And so the way I will approach this is a very fun preseason for me because I don't know what to do. I'm used to going to football camp and saying, well, maybe in a few years that guy will be ready. And, how many camps have I covered where I'm covering what's going to be a 3-9 or a 4-8 season? And you're just looking at it and saying, well, maybe 2 or 3 years, that type of thing. The pieces are there. They just won 8 games. They have a lot back. They have All-Americans here. It's a lot more fun. Look, seasons can go up and down. And Toledo, the first opponent, Toledo last year had like 8 games that were within 4 points or something like that. That's one of those seasons that could climb all the way up to 10-2, could be 4-8, and just razor thin on those margins. So you never know what kind of outcome you're going to get. But what have Illinois fans always wanted is competitive football in Champaign, and this is competitive football, and that feels good.
All right, hear from Robert every Sunday on the Sunday No Huddle, at least game weeks. Maybe we'll throw in a bye week, maybe. We'll see when we get there. But this coming Sunday, the debut, once again, Sunday No Huddle right here on WCIA. You can find the whole thing on YourIlliNation.com as well. Robert, thanks so much for your time preseason. Let's have a good year.
You got it. Thanks.